Okay, step one is to quilt your background block to the batting. I don't use the batting at this point. I do a different quilt as you go than most people do. And I've got a whole separate workshop that's free that takes you through all of the steps in a lot of detail. It's called Let's Make a Quilt, and there's a link in your pattern. But in a nutshell, step one is to quilt your background block to your batting only. And then you can go all fancy with it because it's just a small square and it's really easy to maneuver on a standard sewing machine. So step one, quilt the background to the batting. Step two, add your applique. Step three, outline the applique. Step four, trim your block down to size. Step five, sew all of the blocks together, press the seams open. Step six is when you layer in the backing, and the batting is already there, so it's just a two-part sandwich. And then the final round of quilting to attach the backing to the quilt is just done, stitched in the ditch around the seams, so it's very, very minimal quilting and pretty easy to get through a standard sewing machine. So my method allows you to do all kinds of detailed quilting in your blocks and very, very minimal quilting when you're working the whole mass of the machine through the quilt. So step one, quilt your block. Okay, the next step is to print out your pattern page. So this is the Arctic Hare. All of his pieces fit on a single sheet. I love it when that happens, but it did not happen all the time in this quilt. You can either print, I like to use heat and bond, lightweight, and I like the printable sheets because I don't like to trace. So in that case, you can print directly on the paper side of your fusible adhesive. If you don't mind tracing, print it out on regular paper and then you can trace it by hand onto whatever brand of fusible adhesive you like to use. The pattern has already been reversed and it's been exploded, by which I mean all of the pieces that overlap when you assemble are separated out so that they are all individual pieces here. So you're going to roughly cut out around each of the individual pieces. And by rough cut, I mean don't cut right on the line. You want to leave a little bit of that paper fusible adhesive around the edges of all of the pieces. And what that does, it allows, so by fusing first and then doing a clean cut, you're going to get, the adhesive is going to go right up and cover every last thread at the edges of those pieces. And that's going to help keep those pieces from fraying. So for the Arctic Hare, we've got 2 eyes and a nose, 2 ears, a muzzle, and a head. After you rough cut all the pieces and fuse them down, this is when you do the clean cut. So now is when you want to cut right on the edge of the pieces. And you're going to cut only on the solid lines. All of the dotted lines in the pattern are just guides to marking the placement or marking lines that you're going to be stitching later on. So just cut on all of the solid outlines, cut all the pieces out neatly. Okay, the next step is going to be to stick everything down, but first there's one very important thing you want to do before you peel the paper backing off, and that is transfer all of those placement lines that I was just telling you about. So all of the dotted lines on the pattern pieces are placement lines, and you want to transfer those to the front, the fabric side of all of these pieces. So I do use 2 different tools for that. So if it's to mark where the eyes go or where the nose goes or where I'm going to do some stitching, some visible stitching later on, I use just a simple Sharpie fine tip pen. It does not wash out, but that's okay because the placement markings are going to be covered up with black fabric, so it doesn't matter that the black line might show through. And these lines, the eyebrows and the mouth line, are going to be stitched directly over those lines with black thread. So it really doesn't matter that I have a permanent black line there. All of the other lines are going to be, I want to be able to erase them. So for those, for a light fabric like this, I just use a Ticonderoga pencil. It's a nice soft lead. And I mark it pretty lightly. You can see on here, I can see it very clearly. Hopefully you'll be able to see it in the video. But I just transfer those lines to the front. And if you hold this piece up in a window with the light shining behind it, these lines, all of these lines will show right through very clearly to the fabric side of things, and you can transfer those lines really clearly. One thing to say, you can erase pencil lines off of fabric using an eraser, but I don't use the Ticonderoga eraser. It has color to it, and it can leave a little residue behind, so I just use a not fancy white artist's eraser. It'll erase those lines really well. You won't leave a trace of them behind, and it is nice and clean. So easy, no fancy markings. If it's a darker fabric, I use just a white chalk. So transfer all of those markings to the front of the fabric, and then we're ready to layer everything together. So one more thing, some people don't want to transfer all of the markings, and I totally understand that. You want to have a little more flexibility on things like where you put the ears. If you only transfer a few of the lines, the key ones to do are the eyes, the nose, the mouth, and the eyebrows. Those are ones you don't want to have to eyeball later. I drew the pattern, and those are the ones that I still transfer for myself to get that placement exactly right, because it takes me a long time to get the eyes and the mouth the way I want them to be. So once I get it, I would just want to trace it and make it easy for myself. So next up, we will assemble. Okay, so I start always, if it's possible, with the piece that touches the bottom edge. And let me actually scooch this up a little bit so you can see the raw edge at the bottom of the block. So the block has a little line across the bottom. That is the line where the stitching is going to go to sew the blocks together. So this is a little bit that's going to go down into the seam allowance. So you peel off that paper backing and just layer that so that the raw edge of the bottom of the head is lined up with the raw edge at the bottom of the block. And now I'm going to show you how some of those other marking lines come into play. So this ear has a marking line at the bottom. That shows you how far under the head it needs to be tucked in. And you can see that there's a little line on the head showing where it gets tucked behind. So there we go. That guy is placed. Same thing on the other side. This ear also has a little marking just at the base. So this line shows me where it tucks behind, and this line shows me how deeply. And then the little muzzle piece has a few more lines on it. Peel off his backing. So this line shows me where the muzzle goes. And then this marking shows me where the nose goes. And then these two show me where the eyes go. So those markings make it really easy to get everything where you want it. I didn't used to put all of those markings on my patterns, but as I've been doing some slightly more realistic animals, it makes the patterns just a little bit more complex. The hare is really not very complex, but some of the other animals in this quilt pattern are a little more complicated, and having those markings helps you get a really accurate placement to make it look exactly like my sample looks. So everything is positioned, tucked, the smaller pieces are tucked under the bigger pieces. Double check, make sure everything is where you want it, and then follow the instructions on whatever brand of fusible adhesive you use to fuse it down into place. And then we'll come back and I'll show you how I outlined it. All right, here's the finished block, all outlined, fused it down and outlined, and I'm going to take you through the path that I follow. I always try and really think about the way that I'm going to outline my blocks before I get started so that I can minimize the number of times I need to stop and tie off my threads. So another thing just to point out is that I like to outline mine with, I do 3 trips around in just a simple straight stitching, and I'll show you patch here. So I try actually really deliberately not to go exactly on my lines because I want it to have this kind of sketchy, scribbly, sketchbooky kind of look to it. So I go around all the pieces 3 times, and I am not trying to go exactly on my lines, except in a couple of places which I'll point out. So I start down in this corner and I go up over his head once. And coming back the second time, I go past the base of that ear once, twice, 3 times around the ear, and then pick up right here over. So I'm doing an extra little bit at the base of the ear, but you can't tell the difference between 3 rows of stitching and 4 rows. So this is an easy way to avoid some knots. Keep going around here for my second trip around the head. Go across the base of that ear, and same thing on this side. Once, twice, 3 times. Double up a little bit over the base of the ear and down here. That was the second time across the head. And now I'm going to go once more back. Once to finish up the head. Tie off. Then I did everything else. There's not much to combine. So around the muzzle, just 3 times around. Around the nose, I only go once around the nose and the eyes because it's black stitching on a black background and you can't see the 3 rows of stitching. So I just go once around. I start over here on the side and go once around the nose and then continue. And then I go down. And then for the mouth, I'm going to do 4 rows of stitching down here because it's actually easier. So I go over once, back to the other corner of the mouth, back to the center. So that's 2 rows of stitching now on the mouth. And I'm going to go again over to this side, over to this side, and back to the center. So that's 4 rows of stitching on the mouth. Back up here is 2 rows of stitching now on this downstroke. So I'm going to do 1 more just down and up to get 4 rows of stitching on the downstroke on the mouth. I do 4 rows of stitching just because it's easier, and here I do actually try and go directly on my line because what I'm trying to do here is not so much the sketchy scribbly look but more of a thick defined line so that his face is very clearly defined. Once around each of the eyes, and then the eyebrows I still did 3, but I did try and stack them right on top of each other, so it's just once, twice, 3 times, tie it off, and then over here once, twice, 3 times and tie it off. And that is it.